Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves. To thank Dovi and Nina Elman for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of the bas mitzvah of their daughter Ayelet. May Shemir Hashem continue to grow into a source of nachas and a true bas Yisrael. Also with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed Ches 38. And we are picking up Emir Hashem on the bottom of Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, two lines up from the bottom of the daf. Ravasi says as follows. So we're still continuing in the interesting sugya regarding these intriguing cases of different types of dough and their halachic ramifications, both vis-a-vis matzah as well as for the use for their use on Pesach. So Rav Asi, Isa shal Meiser Sheni. So Rav Asi said as follows: Isa, a dough of Meiser Sheni. So also remember again, Meiser Sheni, which we've spoken about extensively over the last number of days, is a tithe. But the halacha is that tithe must be taken to Yerushalayim and consumed in Yerushalayim itself. So what happens if one has a Meiser Sheni dough? So Rabbi said this is the subject of an interesting machlokes in general. Let's read this and then we'll explain. Se'isa shal Meiser Sheni, l'divrei Rabbi Meir p'tura min hachala. According to Rabbi Meir, such a dough is pater from chala. L'divrei chachamim chayev es b'chala. But according to the chachamim, ultimately again the dough is chayiv and chala. And Rabbi say, what's the machlokes? If you look at Rashi says, l'divrei Rabbi Meir, da'amar be'perek sheni d'kiddushin, meiser mamon gavoahu. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, according to Rabbi Meir, so meiser sheni is considered to be mamon gavoa. It is considered to be the property of the Ribono Shel Olam. Now I will say, I want to be clear, Rabbi Meir, of course, Rabbi Meir is not disagreeing that the individual has the right to consume Meiser Sheni, right? That's not the machlokes. Of course, a person has the right. The shaila is, but what is the nature? What is the status, ultimately, again, of this Meiser Sheni item? Rabbi Meir essentially says that although you have the right to consumption, halacha l'maaseh really has the status of Kodesh. Because it has the status of Kodesh, therefore halacha l'maaseh, it's exempt from chala. The Chacham, on the other hand, no, Meiser Sheni is not Kodesh, right? Meiser Sheni is, both said now to say it's chulin is also a little bit of a misnomer. It's not chulin either, but rather again, it's certainly it's regular. It's a regular item that has an additional level of sanctity, but therefore the Chacham will say that it's chayiv in chala. Top of Lamed Ches, so too, matzos shal Meiser Sheni. L'div Rabbi Meir ein adam yotzei b'yadei also. We're going to both say if you have matzah made out of Meiser Sheni, according to Rabbi Meir, one cannot discharge their obligation on Pesach with such matzahs. And I will say now we'll see exactly why that is. L'divrei chachamim yotzei. According to that, yotzei b'yadei also b'Pesach. According to the chachamim, you can discharge your obligation on Pesach with matzos made of Meiser Sheni. We'll say another case, esrog shal Meiser Sheni. Listen to this interesting case. What happens if you have an esrog, a Meiser Sheni esrog? So what's the halacha? L'divrei Rabbi Meir ein yotzei ba yedei chavas. According to Rabbi Meir, you cannot fulfill your obligation on Sukkot with a Meiser Sheni esrog. However, but according to the Chachamim, one is able to go ahead and fulfill their obligation on Yom Tov with a Meiser Sheni esrog. Therefore, Rabbi say, halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara outlines three areas of machlokes of Meiser Sheni. Number one, chala. Number two, matzah. Number three, esrog. So remember again, if you have a dough of Meiser Sheni, you have matzah of Meiser Sheni, you have an esrog of Meiser Sheni. In all of these cases, Rabbi Meir's shita is that halacha l'maisa, Meiser Sheni is considered to be mamon gavoa, consecrated money. So because of that, it's exempted from chala. Because remember again, only regular dough is chayiv in chala. Now, esrog and matzah will have to see what the issue is, right? Why is it that you can't use an esrog of Meiser Sheni? Why is it that you can't use matzah of Meiser Sheni, that's not yet clear. So we'll analyze that. Maskif lo Rav Papa. So Rav Papa raised the kasha. Bishlama isa dichsiv arisosechem mishalachem. So we'll say, I understand by matzah, by challah, when the Torah speaks out the obligation of challah, the Torah says, Reishis arisosechem tarimu challah, or I should say, Reishis arisosechem challah tarimu truma. So we'll say, the Torah speaks out the obligation to go ahead and separate challah. It speaks out separating challah from your dough. From your dough. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, I can understand why Rabbi Meir would hold that the mitzvah of challah would not apply to Meiser Sheni. Why not? Because again, Meiser Sheni, according to Rabbi Meir, it's not my dough. It's not my dough, but rather ultimately, again, it's the dough of the Ribono Shel Olam. I understand why would it be exempt from matzah. Tichsiv arisosechem b'shalachem. Esrog nami dichsiv. Also by esrog also I could hear why Rabbi Meir would say that halacha l'maisi you can't use an esrog of Meiser Sheni. Dichsiv ulakachtem lochem. Because Rabbi say the pasuk says by esrog you will take for you. Mishalachem yehei. I understand that by esrog maybe it has to be mine as well. So we'll say, remember again, just to be clear, Rabbi Meir's shita is the machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, very simply put, is who does Meiser Sheni belong to. Of course, everyone is agreeing that I have the right to consume Meiser Sheni. The shaila is who does it belong to. Rabbi Meir saying Meiser Sheni belongs to the Ribono Shel Olam. Chachamim saying Meiser Sheni belongs to the individual. So according to Rabbi Meir, who holds that Meiser Sheni belongs to the Ribono Shel Olam, so I understand I don't have to take I don't have to take challah from Meiser Sheni. Why? Because arisosechem, the Torah phrases the obligation of challah as something you take from your dough. I understand if I can't use an esrog of Meiser Sheni. Why? Because again, by esrog it says, "L'kachtem lochem," you will take for yourselves. But matzah, niksiv matzaschem. But I will say, why can't I use matzah made from Meiser Sheni? There's no possessive, right? There's no element of possession written by matzah, right? Does it say you have to eat matzah schem, your matzah? It just says you have to eat matzah. You have to eat matzah. So why should there be an issue if at the end of the day the matzah comes from Meiser Sheni? Amarava vitim Rav Yirmiyah bar Shalmia asya lechem. We'll say, listen to this. Rabbi Meir makes a gzeir shava of lechem. Lechem. What's the gzeir shava of lechem? Ksiv hacha lechem oni. It says by matzah lechem oni, which Rabbi say again. We know that word oni is subject to dispute as well. But let's just translate it as pshuto shel mikra, poor man's bread. Uksiv hasam, and it says by challah v'hayo ba'ach lochem milechem haaretz, and it will be when you go ahead and eat from the bread of the land. So we'll say essentially, according to Rabbi Meir, you would make a gzeir shava between matzah and challah. Sounds interesting, right? Between matzah and challah. Ma l'halon mishalachem. Just like by the halacha of challah, you're only obligated to go ahead and take challah from your dough, afkan mishalachem. So too by matzah, in order to fulfill the obligation of matzah on Pesach, you only fulfill the obligation if halacha l'maisa, you end up going ahead and taking from or eating from your own matzah. So therefore I will say, we've now successfully established the shita of Rabbi Meir, that halacha l'maisa, Meiser Sheni is exempt from challah. Meiser Sheni cannot be used to make matzah, and Meiser Sheni cannot be used to furnish an esrog through which you would go ahead and fulfill the mitzvah of daled minim on Sukkos. All the same. Now again, the logic is different for each. When it comes to challah, arisosechem, it's your dough. When it comes to esrog, ulakachtem lochem, you should take your own. Where does matzah? Matzah learned out lechem from challah. Chachamim, remember again, disagree with all of this, which is how we paskin. We paskin like the Chachamim. Chachamim disagree with all of this. Chachamim say, no, that's not true. Meiser Sheni is not mamon gavoa. Right? Remember again, the Chachamim say Meiser Sheni is yours. It's yours to eat, but again, it's yours to eat with restrictions and limitations. Right? That halacha is you have to eat it in Yerushalayim, you have to eat it in a state of Tara, you can't be in Avelo. So yes, it's yours, but lamaisa, it's yours to be consumed in a certain specific way. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. So we'll say, let's bring a brisa that supports this, or a statement that supports this. Isa shal meiser sheni p'tura min achala, divrei Rabbi Meir. The dough of meiser sheni is pata from chala. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. V'chachamim omrim chayebes. But the chachamim say such a dough is chayiv. To which the Gemara say, what do you mean you're bringing this as a proof? Haynuhach. This is exactly what we just said before. It's the same thing. Same exact statement we just made before. To which the Gemara says, no, look at what we're driving at. So the Gemara says, Hachi ka'amar. Let's say it's Hachi, this is what it means to say. Leima, midimiflagi bahanach, midimiflagi be'isa, bahanach nami pligi. So Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. In the first iteration of this machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, the Gemara quoted 3 areas of dispute. Chala, matzah, and esrog. If you notice over here, when the Gemara is quoting, the Gemara is only quoting one area of dispute. And what's the one area of dispute? Chala. So the Gemara says, well, let's analyze this. Leima midemiflagi be'isa, bahanach nami pligi. Perhaps the same way that Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim argue in the case of taking chala from a dough of meiser sheni, they argue in the other cases as well as of matzah and esrog, o dilma, or perhaps according to this version, shiny hasam, maybe chala is different. Dichsiv arisosechem trezimni. I will say maybe chala is different. Why is chala going to be different? Because I will say, interestingly enough, the halacha is that the Torah writes the word arisosechem, your dough, twice. Your dough twice. And maybe what the Gemara is suggesting is maybe Rabbi Meir doesn't argue in all cases of meiser sheni. Maybe he only argues in chala of meiser sheni. Why would he argue in chala of meiser sheni? Because halacha l'maisa, there's a possessive word written twice. Arisosechem. So maybe it's tafka only in the case of chala, or Rabbi Meir holds that dough of meiser sheni at the end of the day does not go ahead and require challah, but maybe according to this version, Rabbi Meir doesn't disagree in the case of esrog or in the case of matzah. Good. So we'll say, the Gemara kind of leaves that there. Bottom line is, this machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim both say is a much more, Rashi quotes that the machlokes itself actually occurs in Maseches Kiddushin, which is a fundamental, yesodistic machlokes. At the end of the day, what is the status of meiser sheni? Rabbi Meir is saying mamon gavoa, Chachamim saying it's yours with limitations. Which Rabbi say happens to be a fascinating machlokes in general in terms of in the realm of personal ownership. See, Rabbi Meir will say you can't tell me that it's yours if what? Right? If you can't do whatever you want with it, what do you mean it's yours? Yeah, it's yours, but you have to eat it in a particular location. You have to eat it in a certain way. You have to be in a personal state. All these, but it's yours. But that's not yours. That's called, it belongs to Chakadosh Baruch Hu. We'll say it's very interesting. The Chachamim, on the other hand, really argue on this level of personal ownership. They say, no, yours means it's yours to enjoy, it's yours to benefit. Yeah, there are rules. There are rules and there are limitations. But the presence of rules and limitations does not in any way constrict or limit your personal ownership. I will say it's an incredible yisod also just in like hashkafas hachayim. The fundamental question of, is a Jew really free? Is a Jew really, because of Pesachim, we think about this on Pesach, right? Are we really free? How can you say I'm free? I have 613 mitzvahs. I have all these mitzvahs saseh, all of these mitzvahs lo saseh, all of these things I can do, I have to do, I must do, I can't do. So we'll say, so who says that the definition of freedom is the ability to do whatever you want? That is a man-made definition, and who says that's correct? Right? The ability, the definition of freedom, just like the definition of ownership, always comes with limitations and expectations and requirements. The shaila is, do you have autonomy over the important things in life? So even by Ma'aser Sheni, the Chachamim will say, you have autonomy that you have the right to eat it. You have the right to eat it. You have the right to consume it, to enjoy it. That's called ownership. That's called personal ownership. It's an incredible yesod that has hashkafic ramifications in terms of what ownership is, what freedom is, even in the face of restrictions and limitations. Quite amazing. So the Gemara goes right there. So we'll say, now we're further narrowing this discussion even a bit more. And the Gemara is asking as follows. What is the halacha in terms of a person fulfilling their obligation with matzah that was made of challah of Meiser Sheni? So we'll say, so just if you can imagine this, you have Meiser Sheni, you take challah from the Meiser Sheni, you give the challah to a Kohen. Okay? Now, now the Kohen wants to go ahead and use that challah. Remember, all challah is a piece of dough. Kohen wants to use that challah to make matzah for Pesach. So does that work? Can you go ahead and fulfill your obligation of matzah on Pesach with challah taken from Meiser Sheni? Okay, so let's analyze. Says the Gemara, according to Rabbi Yossi Alili, it's not a shaila. Why not, Rabbi say? Listen to this. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Hashta b'chulin lo nafik b'chalaso. Sorry, b'chalaso mibai. Both say, remember again, Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that halacha l'maisa, you can't use Meiser Sheni for matzah in general. Why not? Because Rabbi say, remember again, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, matzah has to be consumable under all circumstances, as opposed to Meiser Sheni, which cannot be consumed, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, in a state of aninos, in a state of mourning. So because Meiser Sheni can't be consumed in a state of mourning, therefore what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's not usable for matzah. So Rabbi says like this: according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, regular Meiser Sheni is not usable for matzah. Then it goes without saying that the challah of Meiser Sheni is not going to be usable for matzah. So kiti bailacha. So where does the shaila come up? Aliba de Rabbi Akiva. The shaila is according to the position of Rabbi Akiva. Can you use the challah of Meiser Sheni to make matzah for Pesach? So the Gemara says, "Bechulin hu dinafik di'imitamu yeshlan heter b'moshavos." So we'll remember again, what was Rabbi Akiva's logic? Rabbi Akiva's logic was that since, technically speaking, if Meiser Sheni becomes tamei, you can eat it wherever you want. Right? If Meiser Sheni becomes tamei, you don't have to bring it to Yerushalayim. You could eat it wherever you want. So do we say that according to Rabbi Akiva, the reason generally you could use Meiser Sheni for matzah is because if it becomes tamei, it is what's called heter moshavos. You can go ahead and eat it wherever you want. Avachala di'imitamya lesle heter b'moshavos. But I will say, if you separate out challah from Meiser Sheni, and that challah becomes tamei, you can't eat, the Kohen can't eat that challah wherever you want. I will say, what do you do with challah tameya? U'lesreifa azla. The only thing you could do with challah tameya is burn it. So technically speaking, there is no what's called heter moshavos. Right, we'll say at the end of the day, remember, one more time, according to Rabbi Akiva, the reason why halacha l'maisa you can go ahead and use matzah of Meiser Sheni, even though Meiser Sheni could only be consumed in Yerushalayim, and matzah has to be consumable everywhere. B'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzah. So how do I reconcile those two things? So remember again, what did Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva said, no problem. Meiser Sheni is also technically consumable everywhere. When it becomes tamei. And since Meiser Sheni, when it becomes tamei, is consumable everywhere, we view Meiser Sheni as an item that is consumable b'moshavos, wherever you are. We'll see here that svara. We saw this a few days ago. That's Rabbi Akiva's svara. So the Gemara says, well, that svara really only applies to Meiser Sheni itself. What won't it apply to? It won't apply to challah. Because Rabbi will say, what happens if the challah of Meiser Sheni becomes tamei? There is no heter moshavos. You can't just eat it wherever you want, because if challah becomes tamei, there's only one thing you could do with it, which is burn it. Burn it. So then maybe even Rabbi Akiva would say that the challah of Meiser Sheni can't be used. So the Gemara says, "V'chala di imitami la heter moshavo." Sorry, "V'chala di imitamiya less la heter moshavos l'sreifa azli lo nafik." But maybe even Rabbi Akiva would agree that halacha lemaisa you can't use the chala of ma'aser sheni because there is no what's called heter moshavos. If it becomes tummy, the only thing you can do with it is burn it. Odilma, or the other possibility is amrinan hoil v'ilu lo kara ale Hashem v'itmi. So say maybe say the following. Maybe say this. Well, technically, if you never designated the challah as challah, well, if you don't designate challah as challah, then what is it? It's just ma'aser sheni. It's just regular ma'aser sheni. Ve'itmi, and then it were to become tamei. Isle heter moshavos. It would be, you could consume it ultimately again wherever you are. V'nafik and you would be able to be yotzei with matzah. Hashtanami nafik, so too here you should be yotzei as well. So we'll say, so this is really quite fascinating. So remember again, according to Rabbi Yossi Agalili, so we'll say, very simple shaila. Can a Kohen use the challah he was given from a Yisrael's Ma'aser Sheni? Right, so I'm Yisrael, I have Ma'aser Sheni, I give challah from my Ma'aser Sheni to the Kohen, which I will say, by the way, is this is linked to the previous sugya. Why do we give challah from Ma'aser Sheni? Why? Because it's not mamon gavoa. Right? Because we don't paskin like Rabbi Meir, we paskin like the Chacham. The progression here is very important. We paskin like the Chachamim. That Allah l'maisa, Ma'aser Sheni is personal property. So because it's personal property, therefore halacha l'maisa, I give challah from it. So now I give challah from my Ma'aser Sheni. Kohen wants to make challah from the Ma'aser Sheni. Is he permitted to do so or not? So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yossi Agalili, Ma'aser Sheni in general is off the table for challah. Right? Why? Because Rabbi Yossi Agalili says, matzah must be consumable in any state. And Ma'aser Sheni is not consumable when you are in a state of mourning, in a state of aninos. Therefore, you can never fashion any matzah from Ma'aser Sheni. Where does the shaila come up? The shaila comes up by Rabbi Akiva. Right? Rabbi Akiva doesn't darshan oni, lo achalti ba'oni mimenu, oni ani. He doesn't go ahead and make that drasha. So according to Rabbi Akiva, can you go ahead and make matzah out of chalav Ma'aser Sheni? So remember again, Rabbi Akiva's issue with Ma'aser Sheni was what? That the Torah says matzah has to be consumable b'chol moshe seichem, in all of your dwellings. Ma'aser Sheni is not consumable in all of your dwellings. You have to consume it in Yerushalayim. Rabbi Akiva says what? Technically, Ma'aser Sheni is consumable in all of your dwellings. How or when? When? If it becomes tamei. If it becomes tamei, you could go ahead and eat it wherever you want. Therefore, since it can be eaten wherever you want when it's tamei, also view it as if it's consumable anywhere and everywhere now. But 1 second. That only applies to Ma'aser Sheni. Challah of Ma'aser Sheni, which becomes tamei, what happens to that challah? It can only be burnt. But perhaps we could say that if you did not go ahead and separate out challah, the whole thing would have remained Ma'aser Sheni. And if it would have remained Ma'aser Sheni, and it would have become tamei, you could eat it wherever you want. So too, even now, that it is Ma'aser Sheni, you did separate out challah, and it did become tamei, we could view it as being edible everywhere as well. So the Gemara says, Ika da'amri, an alternate version of this, Havade loti boilecha. The vade amrinan hoil. So we'll say, according to this alternate version, the Gemara says, no. According to Rabbi Akiva, there's no shaila. You could even use matzah made out of challah of Ma'aser Sheni, because we say hoil. We'll say hoil means since, right? So what it would really translate, what we just said before, is since if you never went ahead and separated out the challah from the Ma'aser Sheni, the whole thing would be consumable technically everywhere in the event that it became tamei. So too, even when you separate out challah, the matzah is still going to be okay because we technically still view it as consumable everywhere. So where does the shaila come up? Kiti boilecha challah halakuach bekasef Ma'aser Sheni va'abliba. So I'm sorry. So the Gemara will say, where does the shaila come up? Listen to this. With if you went ahead and you made matzah from challah, which was purchased with Ma'aser Sheni money. So a little bit of a change over here, right? The Kohen went ahead. So we'll say, so in the previous case, we were talking about separating out challah from actual Ma'aser Sheni. Now, I have the Kohen as Ma'aser Sheni funds. He uses Meiser Sheni money to purchase challah. Now the shaila is, can you make matzah out of that challah? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Halakuach bekesef Meiser Sheni. It's right across in Tosas O Dilma. Halakuach bekesef Meiser Sheni. Birushalayim kidichsiv v'nasata hakesef b'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha. Okay, so now watch this. According to the Rabbanon, there's not a shayla. Why not? Kevan da amri yipade haynu meiser. So also listen to this. The shayla is, what happens if you go ahead and you purchase an item, right? You purchase food with ma'os meiser sheni, and that food becomes tameh. What's the status of the food? So the Rabbanon say yipade, no problem, it can be redeemed. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Lo alibad Rabbanon, the pligi alei Rabbi Yehuda va'amri lakuach bekesef meiser shenitma yipade da'alima lemitvas piyona." We'll say the Rabbanon hold that halacha lemaisa. If you purchase food with meiser sheni money and that food becomes tameh, you have the ability to redeem that food. Kiti bailacha, where does the shaila come up? Alibad Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar Yikaver. But Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you go ahead and you purchase food with Meiser Sheni money, and then that food becomes tameh, there's no redemption. Rather, you just have to bury it. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, if you go ahead and you purchase food with Meiser Sheni money and the food that becomes tameh, yipada. So ultimately, again, the Rabbanan say no problem, just redeem it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer yikaver. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to bury it. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Mi amrinan hoil v'ilo lakuachavi v'hoil lo kara ala Hashem v'itmi yesh lo heter b'moshavos v'nafik bei hashta nami nafik bei. So both say, so now watch this. What do you do with challah, which was purchased with ma'os with Meiser Sheni money, which became tameh, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who normally says such an item would have to be buried. So do we say that halacha l'maisa, if you never went ahead and used the money to purchase, if you never converted the Meiser Sheni to money, and you just had original Meiser Sheni, and that Meiser Sheni, and you never separated out challah, and the Meiser Sheni had become tameh, that Meiser Sheni ultimately again would be consumable wherever you are, so too even in a case where I redeemed the Meiser Sheni for money, used the money to purchase challah, the challah became tameya, even then it's viewed as if it could be consumed anywhere. So the Gemara says, oh Dilma, chad hoil armina, and trey hoil lo armina. And we'll say, maybe we just say one hoil. And others will say, so maybe there are just so many steps that the halachic imagination could take, right? You could say, if only once, but to keep saying if only, right? Because you must remember again, in order to go ahead and use this matzah, according to Rabbi Yehuda, what you would have to say is like this. You would have to say, had I never redeemed the Meiser Sheni onto money, and had I never used the money to purchase the challah, and had the challah never become tameh, so i.e., if the original Meiser Sheni would have remained intact and it would have become tameh, it would have been consumable b'chol moshosechem, wherever you are, and therefore again, it's fit for use as matzah even in this case. That's reversing multiple steps. So maybe Rabbi Yehuda only holds that at most you could reverse one step, meaning when I say reverse, you could view it as if you are reversing one step, but multiple steps you can't. Says the Gemara, Amarava, Nistabra, Shem Meiser Chatu. Rava says it would appear that halacha l'maisa, you can even go through these many different steps. Ultimately, why? Because again, Shem Meiser, all of this is essentially, it's one big hoil. Okay, so we'll say so good. So these are the machlokes in these cases. But again, I just want to point out for our purposes, just kind of with a takeaway, we have the machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim regarding the general status of Meiser Sheni. This is what you should retain: the general status of Meiser Sheni. And because we paskin like the Chachamim, namely that halacha l'maisa Meiser Sheni is not mamon gavoa. It is not consecrated property, rather it is personal property. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, one is permitted to go ahead and fashion matzah out of Meiser Sheni. And the truth is, the Kohen who goes ahead and separates it, challah from Meiser Sheni, is permitted to make matzah from that as well. Good. Chalas told the Rikiki Nazir. We'll say next. Remember again, going back now to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said if you have toda loaves, so we'll say you're bringing a carbon toda, and halacha l'maaseh you have loaves for that toda. Or you were a Nazir and you're bringing your Nazirite offering at the conclusion of your Neder Naziros. So I will say, so remember again, the Mishnah says, can you use it for matzah? So the Mishnah said, it depends. It depends. What does it depend on? Asa'an la'atzmo ein yotzim. I was reading from the Mishnah. If you fashion these items, you made the Toda loaves, or you made the Nazir wafers for your own carbon, you're about to bring a carbon Toda, or you're bringing a carbon Nazir, and you made this to satisfy your obligation, then halacha l'maisa you can't use them for matzah. However, asan limkar bashuk. But if you made these items to sell them, right? I'm going to sell it in the marketplace. Then halacha l'maisa I can use it for matzah. So says the Gemara, minhani mili. We'll say, from where do you know that halacha l'maisa? Why can't I use? Who cares why I made it? Why can't I use a loaf, right? As long as it's not chametz and it satisfies the criteria of matzah. Who cares that I made it for my carbon toda or for my carbon naziros? Why can't I use it ultimately again for matzah and Pesach? Amar Rabba, so we'll say interesting machlokes. Rabba says the Amar Kra, because the pasuk says Amar Beis ushmartem es hamatzos. Because we'll say, listen to this. This is incredibly important. The Torah says you shall guard the matzahs. Matzah mishtameres l'shem matzah. So we'll say what this means is, in order to go ahead and fulfill one's obligation of matzah, you need shmura matzah. Shmura matzah. We'll say, what does shmura matzah mean? It means matzah which was guarded for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah. You need matzah mishtameres l'shem matzah. Matzah that has been guarded from becoming chametz for the express purpose of fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah. Take a look at the top Rashi. Lamed Chesam Beis. Kol shimur sha'ata mishamra shelo tachmitz hiskavin l'shem matzah shal mitzvah. With this entire time, when you make sure, I will say, this is going to be incredibly important, because remember what the Gemara is, the whole idea that we have a concept of shmura matzah, right, comes from this Gemara. Because remember again, comes from this pasuk, because I will say, remember again, technically speaking, before I saw this, if you ask me, what's the din of matzah? Din of matzah is very simple. I need to use matzah. That's not chametz. That's the din of matzah. It can't be chametz. But what you see, I will say over here, is that the Gemara is understanding that no, there's an element of kavana that is part of the production of matzah as well. Ushmartem es hamatzos. What does it mean? The matzos mean shmira. So Rabba's understanding it needs shmira. It means guarding l'shem mitzvah. But dafka l'shem mitzvahs matzah, as opposed to, let's say, the wafer used for a carbon toda, or the wafer used for your carbon naziros, where these matzahs are guarded. It's true that they're guarded, but they're guarded for the sake of a separate mitzvah. They're guarded for carbonic purposes. They're not being guarded for the sake of matzah's mitzvah. I'll say, so this line, this statement of Rabbah is incredibly important. That the matzahs used to discharge our biblical obligation on the night of the Seder, ushmartem es hamatzos, they require a shmira l'shem mitzvahs matzah. And I will say, now of course you know what's going to be the fundamental shaila. The fundamental shaila is, from what point in time is this particular shmira necessary? So of course this is the big machlokes haposkim. By shmura matzah, is it shmura mishas ketzira, shmura mishas Tchina, does it have to be guarded from the time that you harvest the wheat? Does it have to be guarded ultimately again from the time that you grind the wheat? So that's a machlokes. That's a machlokes in halacha, which Shemir Hashem, hopefully one of these days we will get into. But I will say, but suffice it to say, Rabbah says, therefore the Mishnah says you cannot use the matzahs of your karban toda or the matzahs of your karban nazir because those matzahs were not guarded, quote unquote, for the sake of matzah, for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah. They were guarded for some other reason, for some carbonic reason, and therefore can't be used. Good. So the Gemara says, Yatzis azu she'im mishtameres l'shem matzah el l'shem zevach. So we'll say that's Rabbah. Rav Yosef disagrees. Rav Yosef Amakra, Shivas Yomim Matzos Tochelu. So this is very interesting. Rav Yosef says there's a different reason. You know why you can't use the matzah of karbanos, of nazir, or of toda for a totally different reason? The Torah says by matzah, for 7 days you shall eat matzah. What do we learn from here? Matzah ne'acheles shivas yamim. Yatzas azu she'ina ne'acheles shivas yamim el yom v'layla. So we'll say, Rav Yosef is much simpler. The halacha of matzah on Pesach requires that your matzah be consumable for how long? 7 days. We'll say, if you're talking about the matzahs of your karbanos, we'll say karbanos have a limited window of consumption. Right? So the matzahs of a karban toda or the matzahs ultimately again of a karban nazir can be consumed for 1 day and 1 night. So that does not allow for the consumption of 7 days. Very interesting. We'll say, so fundamental machlokas between Rabbah and Rav Yosef. I just want to point out, everyone is agreeing, I will say, on the Ikar Halacha, right? In other words, remember, I just want to point out, the din in the Mishnah is not disputed, right? The din in the Mishnah is, if you're bringing a karban, you're bringing a karban toda, you're bringing a karban nazir, and you have matzahs for those karbanos, you cannot use those matzahs to satisfy your obligation of achilas matzah on Pesach. If you made it for resale, then you can use it. We'll get to that in just a moment. We're trying to figure out why can't I use my sacrificial matzahs ultimately again for the mitzvah matzah on Pesach? Rabba, because again, ushmartem es hamatzahs, the matzahs you use on Pesach have to be specifically guarded for the mitzvah of matzah, not for the mitzvah of karbanos. And these were made and quote unquote guarded for the mitzvah of karbanos. Rav Yosef, v'achalta shivas yamim matzos tochelu. Matzah has to be consumable for 7 days. These matzahs are not consumable for 7 days. They're only consumable for 1 day. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, not usable. So Tanya Kavase de Rabba, V'Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Yosef. So we have a brayso that supports both of these opinions. Tanya Kavase de Rabba, we have a brayso that supports Rabba. Yachol Yetze Yidei Chovaso Bechalos Toda Rekike Nazir. You might have thought that one could fulfill their matzah obligation on Pesach with Toda loaves. When I say loaves, you understand I don't mean loaves. Toda matzahs or Nazir matzahs. Talmud Lomar Ushmartem es hamatzos matzah mishtameres l'shem matzah yotzas azu she'ina mishtameres l'shem matzah el l'shum zevach. Therefore, most of the Torah says, Ushmartem es hamatzos, the matzah you use on the night of Pesach, right, to fulfill your obligation, must be matzah guarded for the sake of matzah, not matzah guarded for the sake of karbanos. So we'll say that's the brayso that supports Rabbah. Tanya Kavase Rav Yosef, we have a brayso that supports Rav Yosef. Yachol Yetze Adam Yidei Chavasa B'Chalas Tador Kikei Nazir. You might have thought that a person could fulfill their matzah obligation with the matzahs of a karban toda or the matzahs of your karban nazir. Talmud Lomar Shivas Yamim Matzos Tochelu. Matzah Nacheles L'Shiva Yotzazu She'ino Nacheles L'Shiva Ela L'Yom V'Layla. Shabbos say therefore what? In order for matzah to be used on Pesach, it has to be consumable for 7 days. This comes to exclude matzah, which could only be consumed for 1 day and 1 night. Good. Shabbos say so. This this is the machlokes. I b'seifuk milechem oni. Shabbos say, isn't there another reason why you can't use the matzahs of a karban toda or of a karban nazir? After all, again, the Torah says, lechem oni, mi shene'echal ba'aninos, Yotza zeh she'eino ne'acha ba'aninos ela b'simcha. Both say this was the drush of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Right, Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Remember, Rabbi Yossi Aglili said the reason you can't use matzah of Meiser Sheni was why? Because halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, again, oni, right? So Rabbi Yossi Darshan lechem oni means that bread that could be eaten even in a state of aninos, in a state of mourning. And I will say, remember, these sacrificial items cannot be consumed while in a state of mourning. If that's the case, halacha l'maisa, that's why they can't be used for matzah. Savrlak Rabbi Akiva da Amar Aniksiv. So we'll say ultimately again he holds like Rabbi Akiva, who holds that no, the drasha is not oni, rather again the drasha is ani. The drasha is ani. Right? Rabbi Akiva said that matzah has to be poor man's bread, not only with an aleph, but ani with an ayin. I have a safely dahavile matzah ashira. Supposed to be very interesting. Why don't we say the reason you can't use the matzahs of the nazir or the matzahs of the carbon toda is because it's matzah ashira. It's matzah ashira. So we'll say, because remember again, why is it matzah ashira? Because as we're going to see, these loaves have oil. When I say these matzahs have oil mixed in. So because they have oil mixed in, so remember, even Rabbi Akiva say fine. So you say it's not lechem oni like aninos, but rather it's lechem oni with an ayin like Rabbi Akiva, poor man's bread, fine. So say therefore that halacha l'maisi you can't use these particular matzahs from carbon nazir, from carbon toda, because ultimately again they're matzah ashira. Amar Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak reviyasi u'mischalekesi l'kamachala. So both is very interesting. That's not really a problem because both say if you think about it, there's really very little oil compared to the number of loaves which are fashioned. In other words, there's only a quarter of a log of oil that's used for all of these loaves. So the amount of oil that actually gets into each independent matzah or loaf is so minuscule that it does not go ahead and transform the matzah into matzah ashira. Okay, the seifuk the ino ne'achalas v'chol moshavos. But why don't you say that halacha l'maisa? The reason you can't use the matzahs of the nazir or the matzahs of the toda is because they can't be eaten in all of your dwelling places. And I'll say, remember again, the Torah says, which means the matzah you use to fulfill your obligations on Pesach has to be a matzah which is consumable wherever you live. These are sacrificial items. And halacha l'maisa, they can't be consumed outside of Yerushalayim. Amrei Shlakish, Zos Ameres, Chalos Todo Rekike Nazir Ne'achalim Benov V'Givon. So Reish Lakish says this teaches us a very important halacha, namely that the loaves of Toda, Chalos Toda and Rekike Nazir, that these Toda matzahs and these Nazir matzahs are consumed in Nov and Givon. Now I will say Nov and Givon were the areas where halacha l'maisa, again, the Mishkan was situated for temporary periods before the Beis Hamikdash was built. In fact, I will say if you take a quick look at Rashi, very quickly, just because of time. So I'll say, so this is Rashi, Divrei HaMaschil, Chalos Toda, Urikike Nazir Ne'achalis Beno V'Givon. But if you look where the lines of Rashi get wide, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines in, middle of the line right after the period. This is actually very interesting. Rashi says, Achelo hukam mishkan hayubamos mutaros v'avoda b'bechoros mishuka mishkan avoda b'kohanim v'nesra abalos. Avres hayarden. Let's listen to this little crash course in Jewish history. After the Jewish people crossed over the Yarden, v'hukvu b'gilgal zayin v'shekivshu b'zayin v'shechilku hayu abamos mutaros. So we'll say, for the 14 years of Kibush and Chiluk, of what we call the literally conquering and dividing of the land of Israel under Yoshua, so the Mishkan was situated in Gilgal. Afterwards, Ba'u l'Shilo, la'achar shechilku, v'hukva mishkasham, v'nesra bamas. After those 14 years, they established the Mishkan in Shiloh, and that is where the Mishkan remained. At that point in time, Rashi points out over here that bamas are individual altars, were prohibited. Vokva Mishkan Sham Nasra bamas v'kulu mefarish mekrai beperak basra d'zvachim chava Shiloh b'mei Eli. Ultimately, again, then Shiloh was destroyed during the times of Eli HaKohen. Kishenishpa ha'aron be'eretz plishtim bo l'nov v'lo haya sham Mishkan ela bayis. Then the Mishkan came to Nov, or there wasn't really a Mishkan. There was a structure that housed the Aron. Right? That was in Nov. Remember again, Nov, Ir Kohanim was slaughtered by Shaul. Then when the Plishtim went ahead and returned the Aron a little bit later on, the Mishkan remained, or the Aron remained in Kiryas Ya'arim. That was in the times of David HaMelech. And then ultimately David HaMelech brings the Aron to Yerushalayim, where he builds it a temporary structure, where it remains ultimately until Shlomo HaMelech went ahead and built the Beis HaMikdash. You'll take it that look at that Rashi on your own, because the Rashi happens to be quite fascinating and actually gives a wonderful discussion regarding the permissibility of using bamos, individual altars, pretty much from the time we enter into Eretz Yisrael up until the building of the Beis HaMikdash. But the point over here is, it becomes clear that halacha l'maisa, it becomes that ultimately again, Chalos Toda and Rikike Nazir were consumed in Nov and Givon, even outside of the Beis HaMikdash, when the Mishkan stood, or the Aron stood in Nov and Givon, which gives us essentially the ability to say that these items can be consumed b'mos shavos. Tanya Amar Rabbi Eloi Shaltis Rabbi Eliezer Mao Sheyetzi Adam b'Chalos Toda Rikike Nazir. So let's listen to this. We have a brayso. Rabbi Eloi says, I want to ask Rabbi Eliezer, can a person fulfill his obligation on Pesach with matzah that comes from Chalos Toda Rikike Nazir? Amar Li Lo Shamati. He said, I don't know. I never heard the answer to this. Basi v'shalti ifnei Rabbi Yoshua. I came and I asked this in front of Rabbi Yoshua. Amar li hari amru chalos todu rikiki nazir shasam yatzmo ein adam yotzei bahen nimkar b'shuk yotzei bahen. So I came and I asked Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua said, yes, it depends. If you made these items for your own sacrificial purposes, then you cannot go ahead and use it for matzah. But if you just made it to be able to sell it in the shuk, you can use it for matzah. So the Gemara says, Kishabasi v'ertesi d'ravnei Rabbi Eliezer. When I came and I told this in front of Rabbi Eliezer, Amrali bris hein advarim shenemru lo l'Moshe b'Sinai. Ultimately, yes, this is correct. This is the halacha as it was told to Moshe in Har Sinai. So we'll say, so therefore, really just espousing what we saw in our Mishnah. Ike de Amri bris hein dvarim shenemru lo l'Moshe b'Sinai v'lo taima boy. So we'll say the alternate version has this, that Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, this is correct, this is exactly what was said to Moshe Rabbeinu in Har Sinai, but still, we need to understand the reason for it. V'lo taima boy does not require a reason. V'taima mai. So we'll say, what is the reason? Why is there a distinction between the Toda matzahs, the Nazir matzahs, that you make for your own sacrificial purposes, which cannot be used for the mitzvah of matzah, versus those which you go ahead and make for resale in the shuk, which can be used for the mitzvah of matzah? To which the Gemara says very simple. Amar Rabba, kol shuk imluche mimlach. As I will say in general, whenever a person makes something for resale purposes, to sell it, he always